Welcome back. If you watched video number 1 of the VCAP, my name is Dave Hirschman with Hirschman Water and Environment and Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program. We have Megan and Blair that are giving us color commentary, just because this is a very exciting sporting event, just like any other VCAP. So we're going to proceed here with video number 2, which is on the all-important topic of site visits. All right. And Megan and Blair, if you don't mind, I'm going to minimize this so our faces aren't going to be blocking the more important information here. But this is number 2 of on this topic of site assessment, number 2 of 4 videos. And this one is on the topic of site visits and also the follow-up from the site visit. The part that is, kind of where the rubber hits the road in terms of meeting that property owner, figuring out a resource concern, figuring out, is there something that you can do through VCAP to assist this situation? So there's a few things at the site visit that are important in terms of data and information you want to collect. We're going to talk a lot about drainage areas because VCAP projects, when we get into the design stage, we're going to talk a little how the drainage area factors into not only the type of practice, but how to size the practice. Soils, in video number 1, we talked about using web soil survey at the desktop stage, and here is a place at the site where you can confirm information you gathered through that process. Any other site conditions, obviously you're going to get information from the landowner. What's been going on? What's the history of the situation? Have they done anything to date? What have they tried? What's worked and not worked? And at some point, your head is going to be thinking, of these 12 VCAP practices, what might be the most applicable for this situation? So we're going to jump right into it. Here is just photos of a site visit that I did with Megan and Courtney from Thomas Jefferson District here in the Charlottesville area. This is an Albemarle County site. One thing that we saw at this site is this property owner really understood rainfall runoff. So you had built this rain chain and these little planter boxes, had done already a lot of native planting. But she also did have this runoff ditch that was coming through her property. So we're going to talk more about that. So here, just using this site as an example to talk about what you do during a site visit, potential practice locations and approximate drainage areas, including the all-important topic of off-site drainage that might be coming through the property. So one thing that we see here at this site, this downspout was in the ground. So it was getting piped somewhere. It wasn't coming out onto the surface here. It was in a pipe going through the ground. And then a quick inspection down by that runoff ditch. So this is where the pipe, in fact, there was 2 pipes coming out there, 2 different downspouts that were coming out into the ditch. There was a little bit of erosion in that ditch. And there's the ditch. And we know from our desktop assessment that ditch runs down gradient for a few hundred yards, perhaps, before it hits a stream. So Blair and Megan, just knowing this information, we've got concentrated runoff coming into this ditch that goes to the surface water. What would you say about the resource concern for this situation?
I would say it's excessive runoff or excess runoff, I guess.
Right.
And it's channelized runoff. So you want to see if you can capture it on the property and have it infiltrate into the soil as opposed to just directing it elsewhere.
Right. Yeah, that sounds good. How about you, Blair?
No, I completely agree with what Megan has shared. I think it's kind of seems counterintuitive sometimes to want to disconnect a downspout from this drainage way and try to keep the water on site. Historically, and Dave, you can correct me if I'm wrong, stormwater really just focus on moving water away. But that's going to cause issues downstream. It's carrying that pollution. So just like Megan shared, we do want to keep water on site when we can, when it's appropriate, and the soil and the topography and the landowner all kind of intersect to allow that.
Right. And that can be a communication topic with the property owner, because some may understand that fully, and some may think that's the wackiest idea they ever heard, to have something on their property that collects the runoff. So, but that is a theme. Going back to what you said in video one, Blair, this is a water quality program. So everything that's done has to be for a water quality benefit. So that is and what are Megan and Courtney doing here? We'll talk about that in a little while. But so once, if we were here and this is the ditch, right, that pipe from this downspout is coming out right there in the ditch. So you have this grassy area. She's got a garden back here, but there is this kind of grassy area that looked like a pretty good place for a practice, except for quite a few surprises from the various dogs that lived on the premises. So that was the worst thing. You have to step gingerly on that property. But anyway, that is a possible place for a BMP, whatever that might be. But the first thing we want to say, well, what's the drainage area? This is going back to that county GIS map. Here is the house, that blob there. This blob here is the part of the yard which drains, and right there where Megan and Courtney were standing is this grass area right back here. So what's the drainage area to the potential BMP location? Well, one thing we know, it's some of the house, some of the yard. If that's our BMP location, and we look at the downspouts and the drainage, it was this downspout at this corner. So that was draining a gutter that ran along the house like this. So we know it's this half of the house would be in that drainage area. And then just looking at the topo, this part of the yard also seemed to be, it wasn't a steep slope, but it had a gentle slope down in this direction. So then we know, well, that's going to be the drainage area if a BMP was put in that location. So always be looking at site assessment. Think drainage area. The three most important things are the drainage area, and the drainage area. So then the other things that you might want to know during that site visit are the soils in the area. Obviously, this is actually one of those sites where the Web Soil Survey said, well, this property is too small for this soil map you're showing. So that's an even better argument for taking a soil probe or soil auger and just doing a quick check. Now, the designer, whoever's designing this, whether it's the property owner or a design professional, they're going to have to do the same thing, but you might want to get an idea of the soils. The other thing that Megan and Courtney are doing here is getting the slope along where the practice would be. This is a hand level that Megan's using with a pocket rod. So we'll talk about some of the site assessment tools here in a little while, but just easy field tools to get things like soil and slope. And, generally when I do this, I find the property owners they love this stuff. It's like they've lived on this property, but they never, stuck a probe in the ground to see the soils. Or, when you do this with the property owner, it's information, but it's also a form of engagement with the property owner. So it can be a lot of fun. So, you go through this process and you're thinking, could be a rain garden. Yep, could be very much, or maybe one of these mulch beds, right? From looking at it, if you were going to disconnect that downspout. And just like Megan and Courtney said, the resource concern, that's the three most important things, is drainage area, and resource concern. Or maybe it's flipped. I don't know. Blair might argue with me that that's the wrong order, but resource concern for sure. All right. So if you remember, we looked at this from Web Soil Survey, the KSAT, the saturated hydraulic conductivity. In this case, it's not giving us a clear signal. Very low to high. So, and even high is just about 2 inches per hour, right? So we know that this soil class is probably all jumbled up. The other thing that we know is this property has been built on. There was a house constructed. The soil, there was probably equipment running over it. The property owner's been mowing it or using equipment on it. So the soil that you may see in the web soil survey could have changed dramatically just from how the property owner's been using that. So we have a kind of a question mark about the soil here. The homeowner in this case took it on themselves to do their own infiltration test, and they came up with 6 inches per hour. Now, this is a very simple test. Dig the hole with a post hole digger and pour water and let it drain out, and then pour water in again and measure how fast it takes for the water to leave that hole. But if you do this simple soil test, the water can go down into the ground or it can move laterally in all directions through this mass of soil. So I'd say think about that number, 6 inches per hour. And even, KSAT here is telling us very high is 2 inches per hour. So this was the hole that we dug when we did the site visit. And as you can see here, it was a very heavy clay. You could probably make some very nice pottery out of it, but probably not do an infiltration practice. So really good tools to sort of confirm. Another thing to think about at the site visit stage, especially if you're going to use a metal tool like a soil probe, and this is something somewhere along the line, you kind of want to do the misutility thing or have the property owner do it, which would be the better approach. So that's a simple website or a phone call. But Blair, what just to ask you, since you see things statewide, when in the process or what's the importance of doing a misutility ticket for these projects?
Yeah, so of course, misutility marks your non-private utility line, so it's a safety issue there. But what's great about, well, let me backtrack slightly. When should you do this misutility marking? It's largely up to how you want to do the process, or the district wants to do the process. You can always have it done before the site visit, just so you have more information when you're on the site. However, I can also understand if there's some hesitancy to do that because it might make something appear that there's a promise tied to your site visit, that this is some guarantee that a practice is going to go through or work. So maybe you do want to delay. In either case, the district staff can put in the misutility ticket, which is nice because you'll end up with an email if you do it online that has details. But it's also a great way to motivate the homeowner, get them involved in the process, because misutility, either online or by phone, is a pretty simple process, just to call and say, I need my entire property marked for utilities. Again, keep in mind there are some lines that won't end up being marked, private lines, things like your internet, or irrigation lines, dog fences, things like that. I know I've hit them. Thankfully, they were closed lines, so it was not the end of the world, but it is the worst feeling to try to do an infiltration test and end up hitting a line. So definitely try to limit that if you can.
Well, and also ask the property owner if they know where those lines might be. They probably don't. To your point, Blair, I had a project in Chesterfield County, and the internet line was not marked, and it got hit, and the property owner didn't have internet for a week or something like that. So, luckily, he's a real nice guy, but that's not something you want to happen at all. So anyway, yeah, misutility. So let's talk about the possible field tools. Starting over here on the right, this is just a soil probe. It doesn't go down very deep, but at least you can quick and easy way to get an idea of a soil column. And this is the auger. This is a Dutch auger, which is, a lot of people use those for wetland delineation. But, it's a really nice tool to have. And I'm going to ask you, Megan, I know you started taking a auger around in the trunk of your car, and why'd you start doing that?
I think it's helpful to kind of see what's going on. I also always recommend a soil test. But the auger is like a nice starting point. So Albemarle and Charlottesville, this area has a lot of clay-based soil. So it's a nice like kind of assessment to like validate the soil map that we looked up. So like what is going on in the ground, what practices might be feasible based on what you're seeing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You might not always use it, but it's really nice to have. Over here we have this pocket rod and hand level. I mean, this is kind of short of the accuracy you get from an actual level or a total station or something like that. But for quick readings of relative elevation, and I just have to say the eyeball is is so inaccurate in terms of thinking about slope and relative elevations. So if you're thinking about, say, a rain garden that has to be, kind of flat and fill up like a bathtub, if the slope is too steep, that's going to be a lot of grading from the low point to the high point. So this is kind of, how you sight through the pocket rod. And some of you do ag work, probably very, very familiar with this, and others less so. But relative elevations, that's something I'm always interested in terms of thinking about the applicable practice. Megan, this is something that you also take on your site visits. Can you describe this lovely book that we're looking at?
Yeah, so I built this book this year because when you're on site visits, you get asked kind of the same questions. So if you had prepared answers, I thought it would be easier. And so this booklet has kind of the checklist of each practice, as well as some information about each practice. So the one picture there is on dry wells and what a profile view might look like. Lots of information on native plants, as well as invasive plants, things to keep in mind. I always like to mention invasive plants because if you disturb the soil, you might be introducing invasive plants. So it's important to know that for the maintenance component of the VCAP program. Lots of people will ask for plant recommendations, and so it's nice just to hand them a quick guide. That one's from DCR, or the green native plant thing there. It's from DCR, and that's a great resource of native plants for people to choose from. I also have photos in this book. A lot of people don't know what permeable pavers look like or how they're installed, so I have a few photos of what possible pavers could look like, as well as what the under drain is to kind of explain the process to people. But I kind of just use it as a guide to help inform the homeowner what to expect with each practice. And I also carry soil tests with me because if I recommend a conservation landscaping practice, I also recommend a soil test.
That would be the Virginia Tech, the little box that you put the soil in to mail away.
Yeah.
Yeah, through a cooperative extension. I want to pick up on something you mentioned, Megan, about the invasive species. Something that I've just kind of taken as a habit most recently is if there's going to be a vegetated practice like conservation landscaping, I want to look around that property, and if I look in the tree line and there's bittersweet, climbing the trees, or English ivy, or the ground is covered with the stilt grass, just some of those common invasives. That's something that you can show to the property owner and say, this is going to be your maintenance. If you want to do this practice, this stuff is going to creep in, especially as Megan says, if you disturb the soil, that's just prime real estate for invasive plants. So looking around and seeing what invasives, or for that matter, what natives they have in the vicinity, because that's what's going to come onto the property inevitably, one way or another. So just another point to make of what to look for during site assessment. So that's kind of what we have in terms of the actual site visit. And then obviously, you're going to have some follow up with the property owner. And that hopefully will turn into an application. It doesn't always, but your objective through VCAP is to get contracts written. So the follow-up could be something very detailed. This is one of the resources, which is a site assessment form. It's very detailed, can be a little time consuming, frankly, to fill this out. But I guess the benefit of doing something like this is it would be really helpful if there is a contract and a project moving forward, that the designer, or if the property owner is doing it as a DIY project, they have some great information as a building block to design the practice. But like I say, I think for me, the most important part maybe is the site sketch right there. Anything that you collect in the field about soils or slope or drainage area can be documented on, doesn't have to be this form, but something of this ilk. So Blair, I just kind of want to ask you, I know you already mentioned in the first video, you guys out there in the field, soil and water staff, very limited time. I mean, and VCAP might be just part of what you're doing. So I just want to ask Blair what the priority is in terms of the follow-up.
In terms of the follow-up,
Yeah, after the site visit.
Yeah, I mean, I think just making, maybe I hope I'm getting your question correctly. I think just making the connection is hugely important. So, reaching out to the landowner again and saying, have you had time to think about this? Have your circumstances or interest or time changed such that now is the right time for your practice? Those of you that have taken conservation selling skills, which is a component of district staff's conservation planner certification, really have heard a lot about that. Now, in terms of this document, it is a matter of time and your I don't know, methodologies. So on the one hand, if there's a site visit that you've gone on where a VCAP practice doesn't make sense, maybe this is the right choice because you can detail for the landowner what was discussed and it can close the conversation and give them something as a next step. So, part of being a district employee is technical assistance, even if it doesn't result in a practice. And so maybe the recommendation is contact the Army Corps of Engineers or the Shoreline Erosion Advisory Service if it's an issue with flooding or stream bank stabilization, or we also use it for living shorelines, or other resources. This can be the final piece. Now, from a coordinator perspective, what's also nice about these documents is if you are working part-time on VCAP and it might take months to return to a particular site visit, this is good for you to refresh your memory. So weigh that into your all the different tasks that you have to do, whether this needs to be a priority. And additionally, if there are multiple staff that have VCAP as a part of their job, but only a small portion, this can help y'all communicate between each other. So these are just different things to weigh, I would say, about whether you need to complete this entire document.
Right. Those are great points, Blair. Thank you for weighing in. And I just have to say the most important thing about a site sketch is these little arrows. Because in this case, the gutters were flowing in opposite directions between front and back. And, as Blair said, you might go back to this months later and say, what was going on at this site? But those were great points, Blair. And that really concludes video number 2 about site visit and follow-up. Next up, we have the third video, which is design, build, and spot check. And that's going to be very interesting. And any final parting words on site visit, Megan?
Yeah, I wanted to add, you kind of want to talk with the landowner about their use of the landscape because there's this 10-year commitment. And so you don't want to recommend a practice that they're not going to be able to maintain. So I was on a site visit the other day and I recommended a conservation landscaping practice and they said they don't have time to maintain that. So you can kind of cross that one off. And then it's like, what's the next option? So it's kind of remembering that you have multiple BMPs to offer and it's kind of customized on what the homeowner will want to maintain in addition to what will treat the volume of water going down. So it's a balance of both. They might not always want the best practice, but if you have an alternative that fits their lifestyles a little bit better, you might want to recommend that one instead.
Yeah, that's something we talk about in the CBLP, Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program, all the time. Don't do a practice that the property owner or manager is incapable of maintaining because it's just going to fail. Yeah, really good point. And that 10-year maintenance agreement definitely gets people's attention. So it's a great thing. Obviously, you kind of have your checklist of things you want to talk about in a site visit. But I think we covered a lot in this video. That was awesome. Thanks, Blair and Megan, and we'll see you for video number 3.